Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition here of Point of View, and let me just mention that you're going to have a chance to hear from me for a little while. And then later, we're going to be hearing from James Hirsen. He's been on the program with us before, a lawyer. Also, a guy used to be in a band. It's pretty fun to have all of that. And also an individual that spends a lot of time in Hollywood. Anyway, he's got a piece on the Church of Woke, so we'll get into that a little bit. Alveda King, Dr. Alveda King, will be with us in the next hour, and that's the 2 o'clock hour, I guess I should say, talking about racial tension in America and also this incredible prayer event. Matter of fact, last time I saw Dr. King was in Washington, D.C., and she'll be there again for this prayer event. So I wanted you to know about that and also get her comments as an African-American and the niece of Martin Luther King Jr. of, what about this guy Donald Trump? And what about systematic racism and all those kinds of issues? So we'll certainly chat with her briefly about that. And then also I might just mention that before the end of the program, Rick Scarborough with us, and we will talk about his organization, Recover America Now, but he also wants to focus on what's called the Jonathan Project, and that has to do with the issue of making sure those of you listening who I would assume are registered to vote, but you have friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members that are not. And can we get more Christians registered to vote who oftentimes aren't? And what is at stake is really the future, not only of the nation, but the future for your kids and your grandkids. So those are just a few things we're going to talk about over the next 3 hours, if you want to stay with us for all 3 of those hours. If you cannot, of course, we post those later. And I find sometimes that I miss a particular broadcast, whether on this one or somewhere else, and I'll go to YouTube or a podcast to listen to it again. And I'm finding myself oftentimes just loving to watch YouTube, just see what some of the people look like and how they're reacting to those issues. So if that would be helpful to you, it is available at that website, pointofview.net, or, of course, at YouTube. Let me just mention real quickly, and we'll get to this a lot more, maybe even in the National Hour, we had the matching fund. And as you know, we had 2 different fund gifts. One was $50,000 that was provided as a match. Surprisingly, on Thursday. I wasn't sure whether that might happen. I know it's always a possibility when we have foster frees. And he originally said it would be a match up until June 30th, and then I'm glad he changed it to July 15th, which actually is tax day, if you haven't figured that out, for those of you that postponed your taxes like I have. So anyway, that's still going to be a little bit on the table, and the other one really had to be pretty much done by the end of our fiscal year. I have heard, and I could be off a few thousand now just since we've gone on the air here, that we're at about 57,000, I think. So that's very good. And we, of course, have some money coming in on the mail. I know that some of you are like me, that you write a check and then send it in. All good. So we'll give you a better count later on, but I do believe we have just a little bit of a hill to climb if we're going to reach that other one by July 15th. So we'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted you to know where we were in case you were at all curious. We'll talk more about that in the National Hour, but let me just start off today by saying, we're talking about maybe the demise of a country, and that happens in history. You have some nations that survive for hundreds of years. The Roman Empire, the British Empire. You have some countries that show up but don't stay around very long, the Etruscans and the Carthaginians. So I guess we're seeing the end of this country known as Chaz, or CHOP. Okay, I'm having a little bit of fun with this, but as you well know, there was an attempt to create a separate country in a suburb there in Seattle. And we were told by not only the governor, but by the mayor of Seattle that this was just a peaceful kind of summer of love demonstration. Well, everybody sort of changed their tunes on this as well. And so the Seattle police are now clearing out what now is being described as lawless and brutal. They have actually come in as well because of 4 shootings and the death of 2 teenagers, which is horrible. These officers wearing extra protective gear entered the city's what's called autonomous zone today, and so far have arrested 13 people, as this article was written a few hours ago, so there's probably more, but I haven't seen the latest update. Then they also have observed various vehicles circling the area, carrying passengers with firearms and armor. So far, no report of violence that I've heard, but again, some of the material I have is dated a little bit, and I'm sure we'll all get more updated information as time goes on. But let's, if we can, hear from the police chief, Carmen Best, who before really was not wanting to speak out on this issue and now has said that CHOP has become lawless and brutal. 4 shootings, 2 fatal robberies, assaults, violence, countless property crimes have occurred in this several block area. So that was kind of her statement. And then there have been all sorts of other people that have been checking the park, which is in the East Precinct, Cal Anderson Park. And there the officers continue to give dispersal orders and are checking Cal Anderson restrooms. They're thankful to the individuals affiliated with CHOP that have assisted officers in encouraging people to safely leave the area, so we will see. And of course, we've seen videos of men brandishing handguns. We have audio clips of gunfire being heard. One clip shows an apparent gunshot victim slumped in a car seat, and you can get the rest of the story. So we knew it was a disaster. We knew sometime Seattle would have to gain control of that particular area, and maybe that is happening today. So the end of that sovereign country, first known as Chaz and then later known as CHOP. By the way, I'm going to get into some other issues, but the other one that I thought I might focus on is something else we're talking about in terms of the pandemic. Yale University actually got together, and some of the people in the statistics area looked at the National Center for Health Statistics data, and they found that there were 781,000 total deaths in the United States in the 3 months through May 30th. And they said that that's about 19% higher than what you would normally expect. And so the assumption is made when you compare the number of excess deaths with the number of deaths reported to COVID-19 of March 1st to May 30th, it would suggest that there is a substantial undercount of the number of people that have died of COVID-19. The question that goes through my mind, and it's the kind of question that should go through your mind as well, because I want you to be a discerning reader and viewer, is even if indeed those deaths are higher than normal, were there some other factors going on, not the least of which could be increase in suicides, increase in the number of people who died from other diseases because they closed down testing for various kinds of diseases, or because they eliminated for a while what were considered non-essential surgeries. One would hope that a prestigious university like Yale would have actually taken that into account. And if that's the case, then there could be what we've pointed out before, the possibility of an undercount of the deaths from coronavirus. But of course, some people have thought there might even sometimes be an overcount because death with the coronavirus is not the same as death from the coronavirus. But nevertheless, we have more deaths than we would have predicted during that period of time. I'm hoping they did enough statistical analysis that I don't have to come back 2 days from now and clarify an erroneous report, but that's the one that's kind of one of the top of the news, so I thought we'd mention it here, right here on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It's easy to make it onto a liberal blacklist. I discovered that years ago. Disagree with even one plank of the latest politically correct platform, and you make the liberal blacklist. But even liberal people with progressive ideas are finding that you can make the blacklist even if your disagreement should be considered minor. Just ask J.K. Rowling, famous author of the Harry Potter book series. She ended up on the blacklist for taking issue with an article about people who menstruate. She tweeted, "People who menstruate, I'm sure there used to be a word for that, something like woman," and she was criticized for not acknowledging that trans men who haven't transitioned still menstruate. Another tweet also put her on the liberal blacklist. She said, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth." Well, the institutions ready to blacklist her range from her publisher to Hollywood. Several of the editors at Hachette staged a small rebellion in a heated meeting, saying they would no longer work on her book. Her latest film franchise, Fantastic Beasts, may be shelved. As I write this, Rowling is standing firm and even wrote a lengthy essay defending her stance on transgenders. Perhaps an apology will be forthcoming. If not, she will be hounded by her words for years to come. And anyone who works with her will be hounded by the owners of the liberal blacklist. This is how the liberal blacklist works today. Stray an inch from what is politically designated, and you face a backlash. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, in just a few minutes, I might get into the whole issue of taking down statues, not only around the country, but even in Congress. Senator Rand Paul had an interesting tweet that had to do with some of the things that Nancy Pelosi is doing, so I wanted to get into that. Also, there are some very good commentaries coming out right now about they are not just wanting to pull down statues, they want to pull down a variety of other issues. But I thought for just a minute I would talk about the subject of education for 4 very good reasons. Reason number 1 is a very good piece by Kevin Williamson, What Are Schools For? Which brings me to the second reason that I think he wanted to write about this, and that is he talks about the book by Thomas Sowell, which we mentioned yesterday, on charter schools. And that also brings to the third reason, and that is because he was writing about that, it has to do with the Supreme Court decision out of Montana, which actually allowed for individuals who wanted to use a scholarship to go to a Christian school to do so, and got rid of the Blaine Amendment, which I described yesterday. And the fourth reason is, I'll hold this up right now, the issue that will be arriving in your mailbox if you are a donor to Point of View is a very, very good issue, by the way, on the subject of education. There is a commentary on college finances. There's a whole section on educational fraud. There's a section as well on public school monopolies by Ivy Nichols, which we talked about just the other day, and also a piece on homeschooling by Liberty McCarter. So it is really well done, and it's just kind of interesting that we did not know that education would be kind of front and center, but the Supreme Court decision yesterday and also the release of the book by Thomas Sowell, just coincidentally on the same day, has kind of put education front and center. Let me quote just a little bit from Kevin Williamson to kind of make the case. And that is, his commentary is entitled, "What Are Schools For?" And then it goes down, hint, the education of children. I think we would understand that, but the fact is, he then goes on to say that in his excellent new book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, full review forthcoming, he says, Thomas Sowell, and that is Dr. Thomas Sowell at the Hoover Institute, African-American, who also has been really a proponent of charter schools and all sorts of other issues. And anyway, Thomas Sowell advises that it is necessary for us to remind ourselves from time to time of a first truth. Schools exist for the education of children. And Kevin Williamson puts it this way: sometimes the most obvious truths prove to be the most difficult to implement. And of course, he talks about this incredible outrage that surfaced yesterday and even into today from a Supreme Court ruling on what is known as Espinoza versus Montana. And if you remember the story, it's very simple. This one mother and two other mothers who wanted to use an existing scholarship program that could be provided to a parent to send their kids to a public school, or to a private school, because they don't have to pay to go to public school. But if they wanted to go to some school that had other charges, maybe a charter school, but mostly it was just for, again, a private school. So the scholarship, and it was very small. When I looked it up, I said, we're fighting over $500. And again, it was the principle of the thing, not necessarily the amount. But nevertheless, they were told that because of the Constitution addition of what is called the Blaine Amendment in the Montana Constitution, there is absolutely no way that you could have access to that scholarship if you wanted to put your kids in a Christian private school. But if you wanted to put your kids in just a private school that did not have any religious affiliation, that's fine. And so really the goal there was to see if we could finally once and for all get rid of the Blaine Amendment. If you weren't listening yesterday, the Blaine Amendments were something that were proposed back in the 19th century and early 20th century. And they never made it into the U.S. Constitution, but it was a deliberate attempt by some anti-Catholics to make sure that no government money ever went to any kind of a parochial school. And even though it did not make it into the U.S. Constitution and didn't have a chance of actually going into the Constitution, it did unfortunately make it in one form or another in about 3/4 of the states. Most of the states rescinded those. Montana was kind of one of those last outliers that had it. And so the scholarship program only would apply for those who would want to go to a secular private school, not a Christian private school, I should say. And again, there is where the situation was. Well, back to Kevin Williamson. He said, line up the dominoes real straight here. Number one, families do not feel that their children are best served by a public school and prefer a private school. Number two, private schools generally charge tuition, which some families would have a hard time paying. Number three, other people are willing to donate their own money to fund to help those families send their children to the schools that they believe best for them. Number four, Montana offered a tax credit for such donations, just as it offers tax credits for other kinds of charitable donations. Number five, Nina Totenberg has a moral heart attack. You might say, who is she? Well, we used to mention her name all the time, and there's a long, detailed quote, Nina Totenberg, who is with National Public Radio, and it's quotes from some of the teachers' unions about this is destroying the schools at a time when we have a pandemic and budget shortfalls. The court has made it worse for opening the door for further attacks on state decisions not to fund religious schools. And so, again, he says, if Nina Totenberg at National Public Radio were a journalist rather than an advocate, she might felt at least a little compelled to point out that this is pure gobbledygook with no meaningful connection to the question at hand. And what is that question? Well, the question is, what are schools for? Answer, asked Thomas Sowell. Schools exist for the education of children. And if a child can be better educated in the private schools, and sadly that is so often the case, than a public school, then if you really have a goal of educating children, that should be enough. But of course, if you're a teachers union and you are a union and your power is derived from having a virtual monopoly, You know the rest of the story. We don't even have to get into it. So again, one of the things he talks about a little bit later is there's a lot of ideology, bigotry, and social anxiety tied up in our education debates. But again, he reminds us one more time that schools exist for children. And that, I think, is a principle that we sort of surfaced as well in this latest Outlook set of magazine articles, because you, first of all, have a chapter here on educational fraud. The National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's often called the nation's report card. By the way, this is not the kind of report card you would have ever wanted to show your parents, because they found that about a third, 37% of the nation's 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. Put another way, 2/3 did not. Only 1/4 were proficient or better in math. Put another way, 3/4 were not. So we spend this money in these educations. There are only, I think, one or two educational systems in the world that spend more money per student than we do. We just spend an enormous amount of money in the public schools, and this is what we get. Not exactly a big bang for the buck. Then let's go back to the African-American issue that we've been talking about, and we'll probably talk about this again with Alveda King a little bit later. Dr. Walter Williams, who again is African-American, and he's a columnist, also the economist at George Mason University. Because he's African-American, has been paying attention to something else. Because when he focused on how are African-American students doing in these schools, they're only 17% proficient in reading and only 7% in math. 83% are not proficient in reading and 93% are not proficient in math. But interestingly enough, he says, then why are we giving these people diplomas? Because the national high school graduation rate is still 80%. That means at least 2/3 of the individuals that graduate from high school cannot read at the 12th grade level, and 3/4 cannot compute at the 12th grade level. So then a lot of them are told they have to go on to college. And as a result, what has happened is that's where the fraud continues. They have to have remedial classes. They have to have all sorts of special teaching. And a fair number of them just simply can't compete and eventually drop out. And so you have a high school diploma, but you don't have a college diploma. And you have to say, if indeed the schools are to educate our children, the nation's report card is not a good one. And so if we see that kids that go to private schools and in home schools do better, and they almost always do, there's very few exceptions to that, then why wouldn't we want to do more of that? But if the teachers union, which is very, very influential in the Democratic National Party, has anything to say about it, we're not going to not only support these ideas, but criticize any idea that talks about charter schools, private schools, or even a Supreme Court decision that came down yesterday on the subject of education. So I thought I'd mention that. Again, this issue, which may have already arrived in your mailbox, if not, you'll see it soon, is on the subject of education, and it turns out to be as relevant as the Supreme Court case yesterday, and a very insightful column by Kevin Williamson. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to talk about, but I just thought we'd focus on the subject of education for a moment, and we'll be back with more right after this.
"2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that a little bit later, about this hour, an hour from now, we'll have James Hirsen on, the Church of Woke, and we'll talk about a number of things that have been happening around the country. Dr. Alveda King will be with us as we talk about some of the racial tensions in America, and as well this incredible prayer event that will be taking place in Washington, D.C., that even if you cannot attend, you probably can watch and participate in. And then, of course, Rick Scarborough will be with us before the end of the third hour as we talk about not only his Recover America Now program, but in particular this Jonathan Project, which will be an attempt to actually get more individuals registered to vote. That's going to be very important. And as we look at some of these so-called swing states for the presidential election, you tell me what happens in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and a few others, maybe Ohio. I'll tell you who the next president is. At the same time, we also recognize that there are, in a very unusual set of circumstances, 35 U.S. Senate races, 33 normal ones, and then 2 that are fulfilling partially expired terms. So probably never had more senators running at any time. Normally we have 33 or 34, as you might imagine. This time we have 35. And then, of course, you have 435 members of Congress, or at least seats, I should say. Some are running for re-election. Others are running for open seats. And then I think last time I looked, I think we have 13 or more different governors' races. We have state representative races and all sorts of stuff. So those are all very important that we'll talk about with Rick Scarborough. I thought for just a minute that, again, one of the goals here at Point of View is to talk about some things that just don't get covered very well. And even though we have seen some pictures of monuments and statues being taken down, I thought it would be good to talk about what's also happening at Capitol Hill. And if you've not been paying attention, there has been a move on the part of the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, to actually remove some of the statues there in Statuary Hall. If you've ever had a tour of the Capitol, Statuary Hall used to be where we housed all the members of Congress, but then they had to expand it, so that kind of middle section there is used for sometimes prayer events, sometimes small press conferences, and there are the statues, 2 of which from every state that are actually in that particular arena. And so she has decided that she's going to actually take down 11 of those because they were in one way or another tied to the Confederacy. And so these are individuals that are certainly people that I think should at least be acknowledged. If you want to take the statues and put them in a museum with all those statues, I guess that's fine. I just don't have a dog in this hunt one way or the other. But it was kind of intriguing to see that Senator Rand Paul just had to kind of tweak the nose of Speaker Nancy Pelosi when he put this out just the other day. This is, again, from Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, who said, "Hey, Nancy, glad to see that you're wanting to expunge the terrible history of white supremacy in the Democrat Party. 9 of the 11 statues of these Confederate leaders that Nancy Pelosi once removed from the Capitol were Democrats." And in case you want to keep track there at home, actually, it is true that 9 of the 11 are Democrats. The other 2 aren't Republicans. They just never really had a party affiliation. First of all, of course, they want to take down Jefferson Davis. He's the president, or was the president, of the Confederate States of America and a former Democratic U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Democrat number 1. James George, a former Democrat U.S. Senator from Mississippi and a member of the Confederacy as well. Number 2. Number 3, Wade Hampton, and he was the lieutenant general for the Confederacy and the former Democrat governor of South Carolina. There's 3. Then we have John Kenna, member of the Confederate States Army and a former Democratic congressman and senator from West Virginia. There's 4. You have Uriah Rose, chairman of the Resolutions Committee of the Arkansas Democratic Party. Number 5. Edmund Kirby Smith, a general in the Confederate States of America who had no political affiliation because he was just a general. Then we have Alexander Hamilton Stevens, vice president of the Confederate States, who served also as a Democratic congressman from Georgia and also as a governor in Georgia. Zebulon Baird Vance, member of the Confederate Army and former Democratic governor of North Carolina. Joseph Wheeler, commander of the Confederate Army and former Democratic congressman from Alabama. Robert E. Lee, Again, the other one that did not necessarily have a party affiliation, commander of course, the Confederate States Army, and Edward Douglas White, member of the Confederate Army and a former Democrat from Louisiana, and also at one time the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. So the bottom line is that when people say we need to take down all these Confederate leaders in the Capitol, well, okay, you've just expunged a lot of history from the Democratic Party because, as you have learned on this program before, that's where a lot of these ideas came from. Now, as we start tearing down monuments, we are being warned by some people that have been on this program many times before that really monuments are only the start. And that is a piece that just came out yesterday by Niall Gardner. You might say, who's he? Well, he's actually British. He actually served on the staff with Margaret Thatcher and has been on the program with us many times and is with the Heritage Foundation, but really gives us kind of a British perspective so often. And his co-author is Joseph LeConte, who used to be actually at the Heritage Foundation and now is a professor at King's College in New York. And they say that the radical left has really hijacked debate over America's monuments to wage a cultural war. And they both conclude that the goal is to deny the moral legitimacy of a democratic republic. They go on to say that violent attacks on statues and memorials aren't mere vandalism. They're an assault on the United States itself and the values upon which this great nation stands. And they said we should stand united as Americans in the defense of our heritage, culture, and rule of law, because the mob violence is really directed as an assault against civilization itself. And so they point out that you are targeting all sorts of individuals from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant, all of individuals who invested their lives to establish and preserve the American democracy. And it almost doesn't matter which one of those four are beginning to be removed, because even Abraham Lincoln and Grant, who were working so hard to end slavery, their monuments are coming down too. Their statues are coming down. And so now Gardner and Joseph LeConte say that left unchecked, they will target every cherished statue and symbol in the land, secular and religious. If they had posted this 2 weeks ago, I would have go, religious? Maybe not. Now we're talking about people saying, no, we need to get even down statues of Jesus that might look white, because that'd be white supremacism. And they point out that on both sides of the Atlantic, Western civilization is under siege. In London, rioters have attacked Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square, as well as the Cenotaph in Whitehall and all sorts of others. And so they are really saying that there is a need for some action. So in the UK, British authorities are actively identifying and prosecuting individuals who've attacked historical monuments. The British government has refused to appease those who seek to rewrite history and trample on the foundations and achievements of those who played a major role in the country's past. And they say the same must be done in the United States. Law enforcement, mayors, governors, and federal authorities must make sure and make every effort to ensure that further destruction is prevented. And then they talk about the executive order that President Donald Trump actually has signed. So the goal is not just taking down the monuments. There's more to come, and you've heard that said on this program so many times as well. It also, I think, illustrates what the editors, interesting enough, the Wall Street Journal said just the other day, America's Jacobin moment. The Jacobins were part of the French Revolution. And as you listen to my commentary today, or maybe printed out, you know that I'm talking about that even individuals who are liberal, even individuals that you would think would never come under attack, like J.K. Rowling, nevertheless do. And here they point out that you have in this particular piece here that the editors of both the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer have lost their jobs after staff revolts. They talk about this leading economist at the University of Chicago who simply was pushed out because he raised a question or two about the legitimacy of the Black Lives Matter movement. We talk about at MIT, a chaplain that was forced out over an email that though he condemned the death of George Floyd, also noted his criminal record, and that was enough to get him tossed out. You have the announcer for the NBA Sacramento Kings, Grant Napier, who simply posted All Lives Matter, and that was enough to get him thrown out. And you have a Vermont principal who was removed from his office after posting on Facebook, I firmly believe that Black Lives Matter, but I don't have to walk around with a BLM
sign, and if I don't, that doesn't mean I'm racist, and that was enough to get him tossed. So you can see that what's at stake here is more than just a few statues that maybe you and I don't care about. What's really at stake is even the ability to openly express an opinion, which is not mean, it is not vindictive, it is simply asking a question, and that is enough to get you tossed. And we are seeing more and more examples of that as well. So let's, if we can, take a break. We have a few more things to put on the table. And by the way, next hour we're going to talk about, is Obamacare going to go away? And what about pre-existing conditions? We'll get into that in the next hour, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, back about 100 years ago when there were those who were really rising in the communist movement, and this was a tactic oftentimes used by Lenin, but it is certainly nothing new with Lenin, but it was one that got implemented in the progressive left and ever since, and that is rather than debate the issue, it is easier to label the individual. I've got a commentary coming out next week in which anti-fascist Antifa was something that was actually a construction during the Stalin years, this came after Lenin, of course, in which they just called themselves anti-fascist, and the implication was as well, if you disagree, then that means you must be a fascist. So the technique has been used by Lenin and Stalin. It's used, of course, today by the American left. And so if you don't like what somebody is saying, you try to cancel their culture and cancel their position. And see, certainly today, if you look at my commentary and liberal blacklist, you can see what they're attempting to do to J.K. Rowling. And of course, we've talked just a minute ago about all sorts of people who lost their jobs simply by asking questions or making statements that really aren't all that controversial unless you're a leftist. Well, if there is anybody that has a target on his back, probably on his front, on his forehead, it'd be a man by the name of Tucker Carlson. Because even while there are some that have a little bit of nuance in the conservative world, he opens almost every one of his programs with a monologue. And so because his monologue will not only sometimes go after the liberals, but he will go after some of the conservatives as well. I mean, he's called out some leadership failures in the Republican Party. He's been sometimes critical of things that were said by people with a Heritage Foundation and the rest. And so certainly you can see that even sometimes the establishment Republicans go, oh, I don't know about this Tucker Carlson. But if you think they have a problem, Media Matters has said, okay, it is time to just drive him off the air. And the way they wanted to do this is through a boycott. And the boycott is pretty much failed, if you want to look at it this way. And it also, I think, underscores why I think Point of View is maybe a little safer, because if you don't like what somebody says on television, you can do a boycott, and sometimes those work. And let's face it, Don Wildman and some others did boycotts in the past, so some conservatives have sometimes used it, but the people that really use it, of course, on the left, where they go and they just pillory any kind of advertiser that would actually consent to be on a white supremacist program. Well, I use this simply to say that if indeed that has hurt the revenues to Fox, and it may have, it certainly has not hurt the ratings, because this came out today saying that even in the midst of an attempt to get a boycott and to try to drive somebody like Tucker Carlson off the air, he ended up in this latest news cycle and in this latest quarter actually doing better than anyone else. Last time I looked at the ratings, I don't look at them very often, but I do look at them occasionally. Sean Hannity was number 1. Tucker Carlson was number 2. Not any longer. Tucker Carlson is number 1. It closed out television's second quarter with one for the record books. Finished the quarter with the highest rated program in all of cable news for the first time since the show launched, delivering an average total audience of 4.3 million viewers. In the process, Tucker Carlson broke a record held by his colleague Sean Hannity for the highest rated quarter of any cable news program ever. And again, I just bring that up not because you have to watch Tucker Carlson, but because it just was a reminder once again that if somebody wanted to drive Point of View off the air, they'd have to go to almost every one of the homes of those of you that have even supported us as we had our fiscal year end right now, because you are the individuals that are supporting this organization and this broadcast. And quite frankly, because I don't get revenue from any kind of advertiser, you know as well as I do that there are probably certain stories that any television network, any radio program might be hesitant about, because after all, they're actually providing us some advertising revenue. And I just come to this particular program telling you what I think and trying to pull the best information, and lots of times even being willing to be critical of individuals that maybe have even been on the program if they say something that isn't quite right, simply because I want to serve you the best I can possibly serve you in. And I thought one other piece that would be worthwhile, it was over the last couple of days, the Washington Post has made such a big deal about a couple of things. One, of course, New York Times more made a big deal about the bounty on American soldiers, and we'll leave that for another day because that's more complicated. But the Washington Post has been very critical of Donald Trump, who said that 20 of the most dangerous cities in America are run by Democrats. And so they did, of course, their little fact check and said, no, that's not true. And then if you read into it, they go, well, wait a minute, 17 of those 20 cities are run by Democrats. And so John Lott, who is, again, a statistician, has been on the program with us before, said, well, it's even worse than that, because if you look at the most dangerous ones, yes, they are all either run by Democrats or, this is the kicker, by individuals that are listed as nonpartisan. In other words, two of those cities, and that would be San Antonio, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada, are listed as independent or nonpartisan mayors. Does anybody seriously think that the mayor of San Antonio is anything other than a Democrat? That the mayor of Las Vegas is anything but a Democrat? And, of course, people in the country and people even in the city know that they're Democrats, but because the elections are, quote, nonpartisan, that is the case. So that now gets that number up to 19 out of 20, and the only one then is run by a Republican, would be Jacksonville, Florida, which, by the way, ranks 17th in violent crime, 13th in total population. So on a per capita basis, it's not even in the top 30 most violent cities, as John Lott points out. You've heard the phrase many times before. They are lies, they are blank lies, and they are statistics. And here's a good example of where that is the case. So, John Lott, thank you for digging this up. I had heard some people really raising their questions about whether or not the 20 most dangerous U.S. cities are run by Democrats. And given the tendency for this president to engage in hyperbole, I know that doesn't surprise you. Nevertheless, he really is pretty accurate, because if you want to say, okay, there's one outlier, that's Jacksonville, Florida, but if you actually look at the level of violent crime, it's much further down the list. And the other two that are supposedly not Democrat really are, but they're simply listed as independent. Anyway, I just try to do this every once in a while because I just think that there is a fairly significant amount of media malpractice. And if particular issues that we're concerned about go the wrong way, you'll hear about it. After all, facts are facts, but this is one case where they just went out of their way to criticize the president for a statement which is really pretty close to accurate. 19 out of 20. I think I'll give him on that last one in Jacksonville. And so we'll take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of issues. One of the big issues that some people are wondering about is, will my Obamacare end because the Supreme Court has decided to hear a challenge to the Affordable Care Act? And what about pre-existing conditions? There's some advertisements out there. Just want to try to give you some facts and figures that many of you are starting to ask about. After all, it's a campaign season. Anybody's going to say just about anything, and we'll do our best to try to dig out some of that. And by the way, if you say, well, I want to read it for myself, the very first article is by our Dr. Merrill Matthews, which came out in IPI and The Hill. That was one they actually asked him to write, because he said ending Obamacare won't end health care coverage, and he'll explain that. I will explain that in just a few minutes. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of these articles we'll be quoting from today, they're all available at the website, pointofview.net. James Hirsen's article, Alveda King's article, the link to Rick Scarborough, it's all right there. Hopefully it'll be your one-stop shopping for the material you need. So we'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we have quite a lineup today. So if you can stay with us for the entire 2 hours, I think you'll really appreciate that. You have a chance to hear from me for a few minutes, and then we're going to be talking with James Hirsen, individual that we've had on this program many times before, works out in Hollywood, has a legal background, also has been an entertainer, but we have his article on the Church of Woke, and we'll talk about some of the issues of tearing down statues and all the rest, but how many of those ideas that are out there in the culture have made their way into the church. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking with him. Then Dr. Alveda King will be with us. We'll talk with her about racial tensions in America. If you're not familiar, she's the niece, if you will, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we will also spend some time not only talking about racial issues, but also she is going to be promoting a prayer event. Matter of fact, last time I saw Dr. King was actually in Washington, D.C., and this will be another one called The Return, so we'll talk about that, and you'll get a chance to know what she is working on and how, if you don't go to Washington, D.C. to be part of that prayer event, can certainly tune it in and benefit from it in that way. And before the end of the program, Rick Scarborough will be with us. He's been on the program many times before. We'll talk about his organization, Recover America Now, but he also wants to promote a initiative known as the Jonathan Project to really work very diligently to register more born-again Christians, because this is going to be a very crucial election. So those are just a few things we'll talk about. In just a minute, you'll also notice, in addition to those articles, or those individuals, we have some articles. One of those by our friend Dr. Merrill Matthews, Ending Obamacare Won't End Health Care Coverage. And also, I've had some of you not only wondering if we would lose Obamacare now that the Supreme Court has actually decided to hear a case which would actually eliminate the Affordable Care Act, but also you wonder about what about pre-existing conditions, a number of things. So we'll try to answer some of those questions. And, of course, we'll give you the short answer now and probably just get Dr. Merrill Matthews on again to get into it in lots of detail. But let me just talk about one of the top stories today, and it comes out of Seattle. Yes, that sovereign nation known first as Chaz, now as CHOP, is coming to an end. And that is, Seattle police have been clearing out the protest zone there in Seattle because it has been a place of lawlessness and brutality. Those are not my words. They're the words of the police chief, who a couple of weeks ago were kind of acting like, well, this is just a summer of love and it's no big deal. But I don't know, something about the city's autonomous zone when you already had 2 people killed and all sorts of other people shot and all sorts of property damage. Now you have the police chief saying, okay, CHOP has become a lawless and brutal area. 4 shootings, 2 fatal, robberies, assaults, violence, and countless property crimes have occurred in the several block area. So officers wearing extra protective gear have entered the city's so-called autonomous zone, and so far have arrested 13 people. This is dated. I'm sure there's probably more there since then. And they've also observed various vehicles circling the area carrying passengers with firearms, armor, and all the rest. So we'll get the final total maybe tomorrow, but the number I had at the moment was 13 arrested. I'm sure that number will go up pretty significantly. So this fledgling country of Chaz, then called CHOP, didn't last very long. You know, the British Empire lasted and still has lasted for centuries. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries. Some nations don't last very long, the Etruscans, the Carthaginians, and some others, and this one may be the shortest-lived country. All right, I'm being a little facetious, but I just had to get that off my chest a little bit before we get into a really serious issue, and that is the very first article which we have posted today comes from Dr. Merrill Matthews, who probably knows more about healthcare issues than almost anybody else I've interviewed, other than maybe one or two other members of Congress. And he says the Supreme Court has indeed decided to hear a state-led challenge to the Affordable Care Act. At issue is the mandate to have health insurance and the viability of the law. Now, you might remember that in a 5-4 decision back in June of 2012, Chief Justice John Roberts, remember him? Yes. Voted with the court's liberals, as he often does these days, and ruled that the law depended on the mandate to work. Okay, so that's the argument. They said that mandate was like a tax, and so that fits. Well, now that the mandate has been zeroed out, the argument being made by a federal judge, by various attorneys general, I should say, in various states, is that then invalidates the Affordable Care Act. And so, first of all, Dr. Merrill Matthews gives you a little bit of a guess. He says, my best guess is the court's liberal will vote in lockstep. I'm sure of that. And then most likely Chief Justice John Roberts will once again provide them with a fifth vote, and that will be the end of that. But okay, let's assume the opposite, that somehow in a moment of clarity, Roberts says, okay, you're right, there's no mandate, and that's the very thing upon which the entire Affordable Care Act hinges. Then, okay, Dr. Merrill Matthews takes that on. Even if Obamacare is overturned, it won't have that kind of impact for a variety of different reasons, especially during the pandemic. First of all, even if the court ruled that way, and I think that's less likely, the court still could postpone the actual demise of the Affordable Care Act for a year or so to minimize any insurance disruptions. And the bigger issue, which is also relevant to something else I'm going to talk about in just a minute, about 85% of the country right now receives health coverage through an employer or through Medicare or Medicaid. Then you get another percentage of those who are self-insured, maybe even Christians. You know, we've talked about Christian Care, Medishare, and Samaritan's Ministries, and a variety of others. So you really don't have as many people as you might think that would be affected by whatever happens to the Affordable Care Act. That was supposed to be, really, realistically, I think a stepping stone to what the Democratic Party platform will call for this fall, and that is for Medicare for all. In other words, a single-payer system. But you're starting to see some ads, and I'm getting people saying and asking, well, wait a minute, what about this? I'm hearing from these Democrat office holders and various candidates that we're going to lose pre-existing conditions. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, in another piece, addresses that as well. First of all, you come back to the 85% I just mentioned a minute ago. Well, let's go back to the fact that President Trump has promised to protect those with pre-existing conditions. But even if you don't think that he is that serious about it, think about it just for a minute politically. Do you think any individual running for re-election in Congress, in the Senate, or for the presidency would even take on the issue of pre-existing conditions right now? And the answer is obviously not. You talk about a losing issue, an issue that pretty much has been settled a long time ago. I think you could pretty much set that one aside. But nevertheless, we wanted to answer some of the questions that some of you have about health care coverage. And in particular, some people say, well, is it possible that the Affordable Care Act will eventually be done away with? And I just don't think it's likely the Supreme Court will do that. And even if it did, it would so postpone the implementation of that in order to prevent any kind of impact that it might have on what is essentially about 19 million individuals who own their own coverage through maybe Obamacare exchanges. So I hope that answers your question, but if you'd like to read some more, it's the first article on our website. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It's easy to make it onto a liberal blacklist. I discovered that years ago. Disagree with even one plank of the latest politically correct platform, and you make the liberal blacklist. But even liberal people with progressive ideas are finding that you can make the blacklist even if your disagreement should be considered minor. Just ask J.K. Rowling, famous author of the Harry Potter book series. She ended up on the blacklist for taking issue with an article about people who menstruate. She tweeted, "People who menstruate, I'm sure there used to be a word for that, something like woman," and she was criticized for not acknowledging that trans men who haven't transitioned still menstruate. Another tweet also put her on the liberal blacklist. She said, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth." Well, the institutions ready to blacklist her range from her publisher to Hollywood. Several of the editors at Hachette staged a small rebellion in a heated meeting saying they would no longer work on her book. Her latest film franchise, Fantastic Beasts, may be shelved. As I write this, Rowling is standing firm and even wrote a lengthy essay defending her stance on transgenders. Perhaps an apology will be forthcoming. If not, she will be hounded by her words for years to come. And anyone who works with her will be hounded by the owners of the liberal blacklist. This is how the liberal blacklist works today. Stray an inch from what is politically designated, and you face a backlash. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, for this minute, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the subject of education for four very good reasons. Number one, we had a Supreme Court decision that came down yesterday, which I think was a very significant case, Espinoza versus Montana. We talked about it yesterday. I'll get into it a little bit more in just a minute. Number two, Thomas Sowell, who also was 90 yesterday, also had his book come out, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, and I'll be referring to that in just a minute. Number three, Kevin Williamson wrote a very good piece, which is entitled, What Are Schools For? Hint, the education of children. And number four, and not the least, maybe even the most, is that our latest issue of Outlook is on the subject of education. It's the July issue, and if it has not arrived in your mailbox, it will shortly. And there's a section here on college finances. Then there's a whole section on education fraud. And then a very good piece by our Ivy Nichols on public school monopolies, and then one by a writer for us, Liberty McCarter, on homeschooling, especially in light of some of the hostility that has come from Harvard. So for a variety of reasons, let me talk about education for just a minute. And the reason I do that is because, as Kevin Williamson in his piece says, we should really come back to this idea that schools are there for the education of children. And once we understand that, then we can see some of the hyperbole that is surrounded even that decision. He points out in his excellent new book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies, Thomas Sowell, and again, that would be Dr. Thomas Sowell, who is African-American, just turned 90, Hoover Institute, advises that it is necessary for us to remind ourselves from time to time of a first truth. What is that? Schools exist for the education of children. And Kevin Williamson says, sometimes the most obvious truths prove to be the most difficult to implement. And he begins to go into the amount of outrage that came from that Supreme Court decision yesterday, which is the so-called Espinoza case. And what the Espinoza case did was really two things. Number one, establish that if you're going to provide a scholarship for private schools, you can't say that it only can go to private schools that are secular. You can't say that if indeed somebody wants to use the scholarship for a private school and it's a Christian school, they should have the same access. That's called equal access, equal protection, all sorts of basic principles. The example I used the other day was the GI Bill. Some of us who have parents or grandparents that served in World War II, when they came back and they were given the GI Bill, they could use it and they could go to Vanderbilt or they could go to Notre Dame. You could also go to the University of Texas. You could go to the University of California at Berkeley. You could go to any kind of school, whether it had a religious background or a secular background, whether it was Baylor or Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins being one of the first universities in America that was founded ostensibly on a secular foundation. Most of the others at one time or another had some kind of Christian foundation. And so the point I'm making is that, but also the second thing it did was essentially end the Blaine Amendment. And if you heard me talk about this yesterday, the Blaine Amendment was this faulty idea of trying to amend the Constitution so that any kind of government money could never go to parochial schools. It was anti-Catholic at its core. It never, of course, made it into the U.S. Constitution, but sadly, in different forms, made its way into many different state constitutions. And that's why the Montana Scholarship Program prohibited Miss Espinoza plus a couple of other mothers from being able to have access to the scholarship to use to go to the Christian school. By the way, it was a small amount. The last time I looked up, it was like $500. So it really wasn't the money. It was the principle of the thing, and I'm glad that they took that on. But Kevin Williamson, I love how he puts this together. He says, line up the dominoes real straight here. Number one, families do not feel that their children are best served by public schools and prefer a private school. Private schools, number two, generally charge tuition, which some families would have a hard time paying. Number three, other people are willing to donate their own money to fund and to help those families send their schools that they believe is best for them. Number four, Montana offered a tax credit for such donations, just as it offers tax credits for many other kinds of charitable donations. And number five, Nina Totenberg had a heart attack. You go, where'd that come from? Well, he just talks about Nina Totenberg, who we really haven't talked about lately, but nevertheless, she's kind of a social activist, and she's covered, of course, a lot of stuff for National Public Radio. And the point is, she has this very long series of quotes and some of the things she wrote yesterday about the fact that this is one quote from the largest teachers union saying that right now public schools are struggling with the pandemic and budget shortfalls, so the court has made things even worse, opening the door for further attacks on state decisions not to fund religious schools. And what Kevin Williamson says, I think it was very well said. If Nina Totenberg were a journalist rather than an advocate, she might have felt at least a little compelled to point out that this is pure gobbledygook with no meaningful connection to the question at hand. And what is the question? It is, what are schools for? Answer, ask Thomas Sowell. Schools exist for the education of children. And so this is, again, one of the great challenges I think we face, because we know why the public unions and the school unions and the education unions and the teachers unions don't like these, because they recognize that they might lose some students, they might lose some power. But if the goal is the education of our children, then that should be the primary purpose. And if you get this latest issue of Outlook, I point out in one article that I wrote that you can look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's oftentimes called the nation's report card. As I say, this is not a report card you would want to show to your parents, because it points out that only a third of the nation's 12th graders tested proficient or better in reading. Put another way, 2/3 did not. Only 1/4 were proficient or better in math. Put another way, 3/4 were not. And so you think of the amount of time and money we spend. We spend more per student than almost any other country in the world. There's one or two above us, but virtually we outspend every country in any significant way. And Dr. Walter Williams, who also is African American, a columnist and economist at George Mason University, is also focused on, because he's African American, on what's happening to the black students. And he finds that when you look at the National Assessment of Education, the black students did even poorer. 17% proficient in reading, 7% proficient in math. And so Dr. Williams asks a really good question, and I mentioned this in my article. Why are we giving these people diplomas? Because 80% of individuals that are in high school graduate. So, we have an 80% graduation rate, and yet we have 80% graduating, but 2/3 of those graduates cannot read at the 12th grade level. 3/4 cannot compute at the 12th grade level. What happens? Well, some still are convinced they need to go to college. They go to college. Then the universities, and this is kind of the hidden truth, do all these remedial classes and things like that. But sometimes the students aren't performing very well there and eventually drop out. And so they end up with these student loans that they are going to have more difficulty paying off because they never got a college degree. And they had this great dream of being able to go to the university and graduate, and it didn't happen. And so at a time when schools are failing, not just academically. If you listen to Point of View for the last couple of decades, you know that it also is failing in terms of moral education, in terms of a variety of other issues, and is inculcating in students many times ideas and values hostile to a Christian perspective. You can see why we think this issue of education is always important. And when we decided a month or two ago to actually do an issue on education, I hadn't really thought about the fact that that Supreme Court decision was coming down, had no idea that this new book by Thomas Sowell was coming down, and that there were going to be some really big educational issues, especially what is going to happen this fall. Are the students going to go back to school? Are we going to try to do home education again? I mean, there are just a lot of big issues. So look forward to looking at this particular education issue that will be dropping in your mailbox very soon if it hasn't already. Just before we take a break, I thought I'd give you an update on our matching fund. As you remember, we have a matching fund that originally had $50,000, then it had $100,000. The last numbers I got were we've already been able to have either given, mostly pledged, $57,000, but I'm sure that number will go up. One of those pledges was tied to the end of the fiscal year, so we've made that one. But the other one, because of Foster Free, said he originally wanted it at June 30th, but then even on the air changed it to July 15th, which, by the way, is tax day. If you haven't paid your taxes, that's coming up in 2 weeks. So we probably will bring in more over the next few days with mail and those kinds of things. So I'll give you an update tomorrow. But we met one match. We still have a little bit of a hill to climb if you want to help us meet that match before the 15th of July. Let's take a break, though. James Hirsen with us, and we'll be talking about the Church of Woke, which is not necessarily an official church, but it helps you understand kind of some of the turmoil taking place. And I've always appreciated his commentary. So we'll hear from him and even open the phones and hear from you if you'd like to join us as well. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. We haven't made contact with James Hirsen. If we do, we'll talk about his Church of Woke. If not, I'll read some of that a little bit later this hour and encourage you to read it. But I, in some respects, appreciate that because there's something else I kind of wanted to talk about, and that is we've been, over these many months, talked about the plight of the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. And this has nothing to do with his particular indictment or all sorts of of other things. He wrote an op-ed the other day, and I thought, I wonder, all the things he has gone through, what would he say? And I thought it was kind of interesting because he said, I was once told that if we're not careful, 2% of the passionate will control 98% of the indifferent 100% of the time. You know, you've heard that all sorts of things. I've heard the 20-80 rule. I've heard the 10-90 rule, you know, all those kinds of things. Here, this is a 298 rule. But nevertheless, that's kind of what he was saying, is that right now, a very small percentage of individuals around the country have dominated this, whether it's tearing down statues, whether it's marching in the streets. And in many cases, the protests may have been quite legitimate, so I'm not disagreeing with that. But I am saying that there's a massive individuals that are watching it all transpire and aren't really necessarily participating. And there is a problem with that, because really a republic like we have is participatory. It's a participatory situation. And in some respects, whether it's church or whether it's politics, we sort of see it like a football game where you have 100,000 people in the stands watching 22 people who are really in need of some rest or some help. And of course, the game is to be played on the field, but I think we have to get a different understanding that we need to be involved. Well, anyway, General Flynn said, the more I thought about this phrase, the more I believe it. There is now a small group of passionate people working hard to destroy our American way of life. He says treason and tragedy are rampant, and our rule of law and those law enforcement professionals who uphold our laws are under the gun more than at any time in our nation's history. Those passionate 2% appear to be winning. And so he gives some examples. I'll just give you two out of this. One is he talks about this policewoman in Virginia who told him people don't feel safe in their homes, and our police force is so demoralized we cannot function as we should. She said, in my 23 years with my department, I've never seen morale so low. Well, it's not surprising there when every time you turn around, you're hearing somebody say, defund the police, when you see some of these morally questionable individuals shouting at police officers and accusing them of all sorts of things, when nobody yelling at those police would probably be able to actually go about the rules and procedures of the police force as well as those people they're yelling at. But nevertheless, that's the way that game gets played in America. And then he also goes on to say something which we're going to be talking about in about a half an hour with Dr. Alveda King. And that is, and I was surprised to see that, because I really don't know where, I think we've interviewed Michael Flynn once on this program, but I really don't know him at all. But he says prayers help and matter, and prayers matter. And so he talks about the importance of prayer, but he also says action is also a remedy. Our law enforcement professionals, from the dispatcher to the detective, from the cop to the commissioner, are a line of defense against the corrupt and the criminal. It is how we remain, for now, in a state of relative peaceful existence. And so he says, what we should do is seek the truth, fight for it in everything that is displayed before you. Don't trust, he says, the fake news or the false prophets. Trust your instincts and your common sense. Those with a conscience know the difference between right and wrong, and those with courage will always choose the harder right over the easier wrong. And he also goes on to say that I believe the attacks being presented to us today are part of a well-orchestrated and well-funded effort that uses racism as its sword to aggravate our battlefield dispositions. This weapon is used to leverage and to legitimize violence and crime, not to seek or serve the truth. And he also then again gives some kind of Christian perspective there. He says these individuals are intent on driving God out of our families, out of our schools, and our courts. They're even seeking the very removal of God from our churches, essentially hoping to remove God from our everyday lives. But remember, we will remain united as one nation under God. He goes on to say a number of other things, but it was just interesting to hear from Michael Flynn, who I think has been caught up in what I think would be, and I think most people, if they've really taken the time to look at it, a miscarriage of justice. And instead of giving a speech or even writing an op-ed, kind of I told you so, instead he's just saying, the 98% out there that are watching the 2%, it's time for you to get involved. Get out of the stands, put on a uniform, get on the field. And I think that's pretty good. And it relates very much to another piece that I thought I might mention for just a moment. It comes from two individuals. Both have been on the program a number of times. Probably need to get him back again. Niall Gardner is an individual now works for the Heritage Foundation, used to be on the staff of the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. So he gives us kind of the British perspective. And then Joe LeConte, who used to be on Heritage staff a number of years ago. That's when I first met him, and now is a professor at King's College in New York. But the two of them have said that the radical left has hijacked debate over America's monuments to wage a culture war, their goal to deny the moral legitimacy of our democratic republic. They said violent attacks on statues and memorials aren't mere vandalism. They're an assault on the United States itself and the values upon which this great nation stands. We should all stand united as Americans in defense of our heritage, culture, and the rule of law. Mob violence directed against it is an assault, they say, on civilization itself. And then he talks about some of those targets in this country: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant. I gave you the list the other day, the short list, and it's getting more and more bizarre because some of the ones being torn down have nothing to do with anything. And I think it illustrates the point. They're just taking down everything as quickly as they can. And now Gardner reminds us that it's not just happening here. He says, you know, on the other side of the Atlantic, you have rioters have attacked Winston Churchill's statue in Parliament Square, as well as the Cenotaph in Whitehall, a sacred memorial to Britain's war dead. So everything's coming down, and I think it illustrates the point. And so their conclusion is very simple. In the UK, they say British authorities are actively identifying and prosecuting individuals who have attacked historical monuments. The British government has refused to appease those who seek to rewrite history and trample upon the foundations and achievements of those who played a major role in the country's past. The same, they said, must be done in the United States. Law enforcement, mayors, governors, and federal authorities must make every effort to ensure that further destruction is prevented. And then they point out, indeed, that Donald Trump has already signed a new executive order which is protecting American monuments, memorials, and statues. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. But their point is that monuments are only the start. And I thought for just a minute there was a very good piece that came out just a couple of days ago through the Wall Street Journal called America's Jacobin Moment. Now, if you say, what's Jacobin? Well, that was one of those involved in the French Revolution. And it relates very well to even my Viewpoints commentary today, which is called the Liberal Blacklist. Because what happened eventually, even in the French Revolution, is some radicals were not radical enough, and they ended up having their necks on the guillotine and losing their heads. Here I use in my example today in my Viewpoints commentary, J.K. Rowling, a famous author of the Harry Potter series, who just had some questions about transgenderism. And even though she supports the so-called transgender movement generally, she also supports the feminist movement. She sees some contradictions. But even by raising those questions, guess what? That put her on a liberal blacklist. She is then called transphobic and all sorts of stuff. And that's where we're headed. We saw this in the French Revolution. Once it gets radical, nobody's radical enough. And here's some good examples from this Jacobin moment. Two different editors in the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer lost their jobs after staff revolts over an op-ed and headline, respectively. You have an economist at the University of Chicago who also lost his contract with the Chicago Federal Reserve simply because he argued that some of the actions by the Black Lives Matter movement torpedoed itself, and that was enough to send him packing. At MIT, a chaplain there was forced out simply because he, in one email, while condemning George Floyd's death, also at least mentioned that he had a criminal record. And that was enough to throw him out. And let's take the NBA as one more example. The announcer for the NBA Sacramento Kings, Grant Napier, the other day said all lives matter. That's enough to throw him out onto the street. And so it's more than just the statues. You and I may just say, I don't really care about statues, but there's a whole lot more coming. And if we don't bring some law and order, America is going to look very different tomorrow than what it looked like just a few days ago. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention as a program note that next hour we're going to be talking with Dr. Alveda King. And so we'll talk about prayer, but I'm sure she's also going to encourage us to be registered to vote. And then we're going to be talking with Rick Scarborough, talking about how we want to register more individuals that are Christians to vote. But I'm sure he's also going to talk about prayer as well. So prayer and voting are two issues that we will spend an entire hour on. And we have not connected up with James Hirsen. Something must have come up. But his article on the Church of Woke is on the website, and you can read it. And he doesn't mean that the church per se, although there are some people inside the organized church that are there. But the idea is that there has almost become kind of a religious organization, which he calls the Church of Woke, seeking to actually create a world where there's no inequality, where everybody's paid without having to work, where whenever you want to criticize the United States, you compare it to utopia rather than to actual organizations and churches and countries and things like that. So anyway, just very helpful. But let me just real quickly point out that one of the big issues surfacing right now with the coronavirus is, do we have an accurate count? And there are 781,000 deaths that took place from basically March 1st to May 3rd. And those 3 months represent about a 19% death rate that is higher than you normally would have expected. So researchers at Yale University, kind of doing a statistical analysis using the National Center for Health Statistics, conclude that when you compare that 19% increase to the number of reported U.S. COVID-19 deaths, there's a disparity. And so their argument is that there may be an undercount of the number of people that have died from the coronavirus. Now, first of all, I hope that they have actually factored in some other things, because there are, as they point out, some factors that could contribute to the increase in deaths, such as individuals, for example, that had a heart attack but didn't go to the emergency room because they're afraid that they might get the virus, and so as a result tried to solve it at home. And so I'm hoping they've sorted those out. There are still some others that are just going to be difficult to sort out for a very good reason, and that is we, during that same period of time, had people not getting cancer screenings. We didn't have people getting various kinds of elective surgery, which were seen as non-essential, what maybe would have been essential if we knew more about the situation. And so does this mean there was a substantial undercount? Maybe. There are those of us that have also wondered, could we get an overcount? In that I think there is a fundamental difference, and some people will agree and some people will disagree, of dying from the coronavirus and dying with the coronavirus. And so a person that dies of a heart attack, did the coronavirus kill them, or were they going to die of a heart attack? And some of this is too speculative, and I don't want to sound morbid, but the reality is that this particular article, which is one of the lead articles today, is that there has been a substantial undercount, and if indeed that is the case, okay. But one of the things we do know for sure, and it's nice to have a few things we know for sure, is that the more testing that we are doing, the more we have an estimate of the fact that a lot more people have actually got the coronavirus than knew that they had it. We have in round numbers about 2.4 million Americans that have tested positive for the coronavirus. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University of Medicine. I think that's a pretty close, accurate number, as best as we can come up with it. But if we look at the various positivity rate, the best estimates now, and this comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, maybe 25 million Americans have actually contracted the coronavirus, which of course is 10 times higher than the number of confirmed cases. Do you see the point? So that means that there have been a lot of people that had the virus, maybe had minor symptoms, maybe were asymptomatic, and you would hope, if indeed this particular antibodies that come as a result of the coronavirus are durable. That's a big biochemical question right now. If they're durable, then those people will essentially be inoculated against it and may not even necessarily need a vaccine. So we'll see. So those are just a few things from the coronavirus, but I thought we might end by talking about the fact that, at Point of View, we depend upon your financial support. And I thought about that the other day when I was reading the story about Tucker Carlson. If you're not familiar, the knives have been out for some time for Tucker Carlson on Fox News. And part of it is because he really just takes on not just the liberal progressives, but lately he was calling out certain Republicans. He's called out even people in the Heritage Foundation, a number of other things. So as much as some of his fellow conservatives or even moderates might disagree with him, the liberals, and especially groups like Media Matters, just hate him. And so they've been engaged in this boycott just to simply try to hurt him by removing all of his advertisers. But it hasn't worked very well because Fox News host Tucker Carlson closed out television's second quarter with one for the record books. He ended up with the highest rated program in all of cable news for the first time in the history of the program, delivering an average total audience of 4.3 million viewers, and broke a record that was held by his colleague, Sean Hannity, for the highest rated quarter of any cable news program ever. So the point I'm making is that there have been many on the other side that have done what they can to hurt him financially and to hurt Fox News financially and eventually try to force Fox News to drop his program. Don't think they're going to drop him since he's now got the highest rated cable news program ever. And I'm hoping there may be some other advertisers that'll step in. But it brings us back to Point of View. And, last couple of days we talked about kind of the fact that we were coming to the end of our fiscal year. And if you wanted to drive Point of View off the air, it would be more difficult because we don't take advertisers. We don't have advertising, and that is helpful for me, too, because I do know that on some radio programs, some TV programs, they won't cover a story, perhaps because they don't want to offend an advertiser. Many of them might do so and pay the price for it. But I'm just here to serve you, and you are the individuals. And if they came to try to take us off the air, the only way they could do that is try to convince every single one of you scattered all over the country not to support Point of View. But because you support Point of View, in some respects, we may even be safer than some of those other programs. And I never really thought about that until I saw how they've been trying to go against Tucker Carlson. But it's been a real failure. Whether you watch Tucker Carlson or not the big issue, just the fact that we've been grateful for those of you that have supported this organization. We have been able to finish off one of the matching funds. We'll hopefully finish off the other one. And in a couple of days, maybe even tomorrow, I'll try to give you a better update. I know we got some more mail. We'll count that up and see where we are. But your loyalty to this organization, I hope, is matched by my loyalty to you because, as we've said before, there's no issue off the table. We'll cover any issue you want, and we think that it's important for you to hear about some of the things that are just not covered by the mainstream media. So when we come back, Dr. Alveda King, she's going to have some things to talk about racial tensions in America. After all, her uncle was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We went to also, if you go to the website, talk about the return, which is a very incredible kind of prayer event, and we'll talk about that with her as well. And then before the program is over, we'll talk with Rick Scarborough about the attempt to recover America, and most importantly, to encourage individuals that maybe are listening even now, or friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members not registered to vote, to get them to vote, because this is going to be an important election. Not only a president, 35 U.S. Senate races, 435 races for the House of Representatives. I think there's about 13 different governor's races and races for state legislatures and all the rest. Pay attention to that. And when we come back, we'll spend some time talking first with Dr. Alveda King. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with our good friend Dr. Alveda King. She is an evangelist, and of course you are familiar with the founder of Alveda King Ministries, also the executive director of Civil Rights for the Unborn, also been a voice for Silent No More Awareness Campaign. Grew up in the civil rights movement, led by her uncle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the author of many books, including King Rules, 10 Truths for You, Your Family, and Your Nation to Prosper, America, Return to God, and How Can the Dream Survive If We Murder the Children, and much, much more. If you go to our website, we have a link to The Return, and so we're going to spend some time talking about that. But Dr. King, always great to have you on the program with us.
It's always a joy to join you on Point of View, and there's so much going on. I'll let you ask that first question because it could go in any direction. I know that.
Let's first talk about the return, and then maybe I would like to get your comments about President Trump and racial reconciliation, racial tensions. But I was telling some of the people that kind of the last time I saw you was in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago. I think it's been a few years now, and there was a prayer rally. But this one is one that we wanted to promote, and it's taking place in September, but tell us a little bit more about the return.org.
The Return is just a cry out to God, asking people to come back to God. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, God will hear from heaven and forgive the sins and heal our land. And that is certainly a desire that many of us have. And I know for sure they're going to be landmark topics. They're going to be powerful presenters and speakers. I'm on the prayer committee at least. I don't know if I'll be speaking or if I'll be joining in the worship or in whatever manner, but definitely I am supporting the return. I know there's just so many people who have been praying and praying and praying, and this is the visible manifestation of some of those efforts.
I might just mention, too, that we got Rick Scarborough coming on later, and we'll talk about the importance of registering people to vote. And I know he's going to also talk about the importance of prayer. But, when we've had Dr. Tony Evans on, he's talking about this idea of a solemn assembly. And as I understand this is really kind of what a solemn assembly for a national day of repentance. Can you tell us about that?
National Day of Repentance, and I have been reminding the committee, the team, and people across America and around the world. And some people, I repent already. I pray already. That doesn't really apply to me. One thing that we must do in America and around the world is to say to God, God, we missed it. Acts 17:26 said, of one blood, God made all people to live together. And so that means we're not separate races. We are the human race. My uncle, Martin Luther King Jr., said we must learn to live together as brothers. I have added as sisters, or perish together as fools. Now, he didn't say cousins. He didn't say different races. And in the real translations of the Bible, certainly King James, but you can go all the way back to the Hebrew, the Arabic, the Greek, the various languages, the ancient languages, and it says every nation, every tongue, every tribe. It doesn't say every race. So I notice in the newer translations, they'll say in all the races, no. And I've got a new book out with my friend Ginger Howard. We're not colorblind. You can pre-order it, I think, now, and it's going to be out soon. But if you do Alveda King, Ginger Howard, We're Not Colorblind, some videos and things out already.
Right.
Now, that means I see color. I was speaking the other day, and I looked at the gentleman next to me, and I said, wow, I see your tie. It's red. Yes. I see your suit. It's blue. Yes. I said, I don't see your skin color. No. Jesus gives sight to the blind. And in Colossians, Paul said, be watchful, basically, with your eyes wide open. Pray. So we have to repent to God about this racial dissension. It's socially engineered, just like social gospel is engineered. Social gospel means look to the government to take care of you. That's not the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we have to treat each other like brothers and sisters.
Again, we've got the return.org, also civil rights for the unborn. Let me ask you about that, because we do have people calling in every once in a while, oftentimes our African-American listeners saying, I do not understand why the leaders of the civil rights movement in the present, not the past, or some of these other African-American leaders don't talk about what seems to be almost like a systematic genocide in which you are much more likely to be aborted if you're a black baby than a white baby. Speak to that if you might.
Very quickly, I'd like to really explain what happened with that, and it breaks out in this manner. Okay, slaves were here in America, sold to the to the Caucasian slave ships and slave masters and all that by Africans. So Africans and Caucasians were together in getting slaves over here through the islands and Caribbean and all that, all the way over here. So we came in here as slaves. The Native Americans were already here. And that was effort for the Native Americans because they were not so suited to slavery to get rid of them, giving them blankets with smallpox and all that type of thing. So here you have all of us here together in this country. Slavery ends with Abraham Lincoln. And we just celebrated Juneteenth. We've got July 4th ahead of us, but we just did Juneteenth. And so the slaves in Texas didn't even know they were free for 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So now here people, oh, well, the slaves cost money. Now they were supposed to make us money. Now they cost money. What are we going to do? And these folks, you let them go and let them live, they'll multiply. Same thing happened to Moses and his family and his people back in the ancient days. They have too many babies, and they'll take over the country. So let's give them free birth control. Let's give them free vasectomies. Let's give them free tubal ligations and all of that until we can make abortion legal. So it's trying to minimize the black community in America. It was all about money. That's why the Black Wall Street was burned down out in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So what we have today in repenting, but we also have to repent. African Americans have hated white people. And, here we go, black power, white power, all that was raised again, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, people fighting, people tearing down statues, burning up communities, all of that is tied in idolatry. And my uncle did say, the Bible is stronger than anything that Martin Luther King Jr. ever could have said. So remember that. The only reason I come back to him, he was a preacher. He believed in Jesus. He served Jesus in the later days of his life. When he was in college, he was looking at all religions and all that. He had a transformation in Christ. And he says, I long for the day when there won't be white power or black power, but God power.
Very good.
And human power out of the human community. So that is what we have to fight for, and to get back to God. That takes us all the way back to your first question. What do we have to return?
Yeah.
To
the return.org. That's right.
Come away from idolatry, skin color worship, sexual confusion. I'll say that. Yes, I'll say that. Because that was a real purpose even for sexuality, and it really is procreation. People don't like to hear that, but that's really why God designed it.
Almost out of time, but so give us a final word here just before I let you go, because I know you got another commitment after this.
I do. I'm the daughter of A.D. King and Naomi King. My mother's still living. I'm delighted about that. I come from a family that believes in the gospel of Jesus Christ, been preaching it for generations, and I'm still doing it today.
Always good to have you on the program. We'll see if we can make it longer next time. But again, Dr. Alveda King, and I'll come back and give you a few more information notes about what we've been talking about right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It's easy to make it onto a liberal blacklist. I discovered that years ago. Disagree with even one plank of the latest politically correct platform, and you make the liberal blacklist. But even liberal people with progressive ideas are finding that you can make the blacklist even if your disagreement should be considered minor. Just ask J.K. Rowling, famous author of the Harry Potter book series. She ended up on the blacklist for taking issue with an article about people who menstruate. She tweeted, "People who menstruate, I'm sure there used to be a word for that, something like woman," and she was criticized for not acknowledging that trans men who haven't transitioned still menstruate. Another tweet also put her on the liberal blacklist. She said, "If sex isn't real, there's no same-sex attraction. If sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. I know and love trans people, but erasing the concept of sex removes the ability of many to meaningfully discuss their lives. It isn't hate to speak the truth." Well, the institutions ready to blacklist her range from her publisher to Hollywood. Several of the editors at Hatchet staged a small rebellion in a heated meeting saying they would no longer work on her book. Her latest film franchise, Fantastic Beasts, may be shelved. As I write this, Rowling is standing firm and even wrote a lengthy essay defending her stance on transgenders. Perhaps an apology will be forthcoming. If not, she will be hounded by her words for years to come. And anyone who works with her will be hounded by the owners of the liberal blacklist. This is how the liberal blacklist works today. Stray an inch from what is politically designated, and you face a backlash. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, a little bit later, we are going to be spending some time talking with Rick Scarborough about Recover America Now and the Jonathan Project. But we did get Alveda King on for just a minute, which actually is better than we did for James Hirsen. He did just call us a while ago and said, "I'm sorry, I was doing television. I turned off my phone. I'd forgotten about it." And so we have posted his piece on the Church of Woke. So I would encourage you to read that, and we will get him on in the future. Maybe not only just talk about that, but some of the other articles he's posted. So apologize that we couldn't get him on. I knew Dr. King had some other commitments, but just wanted to slip her in for two reasons. Number one, the return.org. I'm hoping that we can really gather together a solemn assembly in Washington, D.C. to pray for this nation. It is something that has happened time and time again. Think of Abraham Lincoln calling for these kinds of situations. And if nothing else, the idea is to tie this together for those of you that are interested in the Feast of Trumpets, which ends with the Day of Atonement. So it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about here in terms of September 26th, which is right in between that, September 18th to 28th. So that is, I think, really important, and it is certainly something that takes place on National Mall, and so we'll see. Maybe we can figure out a way to cover that live or to have at least a correspondent call in, and so we'll see what that is. So if you'd like to know more, if you're responsible for the prayer ministry of your church or you know a person that is, send them to thereturn.org. but also mentioned Civil Rights for the Unborn, which is also the organization that she has been a part of. If you're not familiar, of course, she's talked about her own abortion, and in some respects, this is one of the reasons why we need a National Day of Repentance. But also, whenever I have an African American on, if they are interested or aware of some of these issues, and most are, but especially Stephen Broden, Colonel Allen West, Alveda King, to mention just a few, they have pointed out that, going all the way back to, of course, the attempt to limit the black population, but then with the advent of Margaret Sanger and the things we've talked about with Dinesh D'Souza and others, there is just an incredible, if you will, almost genocide of the African American population. If you look at where many of these Planned Parenthood clinics are located, they're in oftentimes African American, Hispanic American populations, where there is the greatest number. And so, again, just wanted you to know about civil rights for the unborn, because that is another issue she has been talking about for years. And maybe some other time we'll get her on and talk about some of the racial issues, because I've never met President Trump. She has been with him many times before, and certainly has done what she can, if she can, to maybe even mobilize some of the African American population to rethink whether or not 90% of them should once again vote for whoever the Democratic candidate might be. Notice I say that there has been some rumbling over the last couple of days as to whether or not at the Democratic National Convention they may do something to actually replace Joe Biden. You say, no, that's not going to happen. Well, probably will not. But if you go to the Axios article today, it's entitled Trump versus Biden, Senility Becomes a Flashpoint. And what it points out is that Joe Biden right now is 77. If he were elected president of the United States, he would be older than Ronald Reagan was when he left the White House. As we start looking at the science of aging, we recognize that in the past there were some very prominent critics of Donald Trump who accused him of senility. This time last year, I even wrote a column about it saying the smartest thing the Trump campaign could do was just simply go out of their way to get a cognitive test, and one actually was done, by the way, for Donald Trump, just to set it aside. And I said that because I assumed he'd be running against somebody much younger, Kamala Harris or a variety of other possible candidates that we could have come up with at the time. And instead, he's running against an individual who is actually older, Donald Trump 74, Joe Biden 77, who does look like, in many ways, an individual who is maybe just mentally not there. And so the other day, the Trump campaign just played a Twitter feed in which they were asking at the end of the clip, did Joe Biden take a cognitive test? What were the results? Why is he getting frequently tested? And there are all sorts of people that are now starting to talk about, is this issue of cognitive decline going to be a campaign issue? It's been a little bit of one. I can say in 1964, there was a little question about Barry Goldwater, but not much. There was a question more in 1984 with Ronald Reagan, but I think he set that aside pretty quickly in his debate with Walter Mondale. And there was a little bit of one with Bob Dole in 1996. But we have never had a situation in which we have two individuals in their mid or late 70s running against each other, and that is going to be difficult. And again, let me just quote from one historian who said, with Joe Biden, there's questions, more subtle, I think, about he doesn't finish every sentence. And during the debates, he'd pause. He'd seem to have trouble thinking about what he wants to say. Those are the moments that begin to start people questioning. And so while I thought there might have been an issue over the cognitive clarity of Donald Trump, it is pretty obvious to just about anybody that's willing to open his or her eyes that there is a question about Joe Biden. And so in some respects, the response, which I think has been pretty lame, just notice the other day, Joe Biden used the denials by President Trump about the so-called intelligence on Russian bounties on American soldiers to question his mental ability. And I just thought that was kind of a miscue. But the fact that they're trying to shoot back is an illustration that maybe this issue of senility, this issue of dementia might be a much bigger issue in the campaign. And I'm not sure how the Democratic Party would deal with it other than just simply try to ignore it. And I don't know how you can continue to ignore it, or to suggest, as Colonel Allen West suggested earlier this week, that they would just simply say, look, he's just going to be a puppet. So we really need to pay attention who the vice president is, need to pay attention who's the cabinet, because they're going to be making all the decisions anyway. He's just going to be a figurehead. But it is amazing to me that indeed so many people are trying to ignore what is pretty obvious to most of us, and that's simply the fact that the mental decline in Joe Biden is significant. Just before we take a break, one of the other criticisms of the president this week, in addition to the bounties on military, is the fact that the president the other day said that the 20 most dangerous cities in America are run by Democrats. And of course, our friends at the Washington Post had to do a fact check in which they concluded that really only 17 of those cities are run by Democrats. Oh, yeah? There's a good example of where what they said was factually true, but deliberately misleading, because let's look at two other cities. That would be San Antonio, Texas, and Las Vegas, Nevada. Both of those mayor's races are considered nonpartisan, or the mayors are considered to be independent. But that's misleading, as John Lott points out in his analysis, because city elections in San Antonio are maybe nonpartisan, but the city is heavily Democrat, and Las Vegas is pretty much a Democratic stronghold, and everybody assumes that they are. So that gets us now up to 19 out of 20. And so when people say the president is misleading when he's saying the top 20, what's the outlier left? Well, it's one city which does have a Republican mayor, and that's Jacksonville, Florida. But again, John Lott does some research and points out Jacksonville ranks 17th in violent crime, 13th in total population on a per capita basis. It isn't even in the top 30 most violent cities among the most 50 populous cities, so it really shouldn't even necessarily be in the list. But it's a good example of where the fact checkers, I think, need to be fact checked. Again, I'll admit, President Trump sometimes used a little bit of hyperbole, but I think he's pretty accurate there. And when they tried to critique him and criticize him, I think the criticism showed a lot about the bias against the president in the first place. When we come back, we've got a country that is going to have an election, and we have a lot of people that are sitting on the sidelines, not even registered to vote. So we're going to talk with Dr. Rick Scarborough. What does he plan to do through Vision America, Recover America Now, and even through this new Jonathan Project to begin to turn that around? So we're going to take some time talking with him, get some perspective. And in this last half hour, if you've got some comments, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We certainly talk about the importance of prayer and also the importance of voting. So we'll be talking about that with Dr. Rick Scarborough. And you can find the articles that we've been referring to today and all the links on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Earlier this hour, we, of course, heard from Dr. Alveda King about the importance of praying for this country, and I know that my next guest, Dr. Rick Scarborough, believes that as well. But we also need to get involved, and the first thing to do is, of course, make sure that you're registered to vote, and everybody in your sphere of influences, then to go out and make a difference and to begin to cast an intelligent vote based upon your Christian principles. Dr. Rick Scarborough has been on this program so many times over the years, founder and president of Vision America, graduated from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, has a Doctor of Ministry degree from Louisiana Baptist Theological Seminary. I remember when Marlon Maddox interviewed him the very first time, this senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Pearland, and got real concerned about some of the things in what was happening even at his child's school, and since then has developed all sorts of opportunities for you to know about. Vision America, Recover America Now, and another project that he'd like to talk about, which is one that he's participating in, and that is Jonathan Project. So, Dr. Rick Scarborough, thank you so very much for joining us today once again on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. I tell you, reminiscing, that first interview with Point of View was my first exposure to the nation, and I remember I wasn't prepared for the response. Your audience literally melted our phones down over the next couple of days, wanting to know more about what was happening in Pearland, so I will forever be grateful.
Well, we're going to do all we can to see if maybe now they aren't necessarily going to call, but send text or a variety of other things. Talk briefly about Vision America and the idea of Recover America Now before we get to the Jonathan Project, because I want people to support you. And again,
that's kind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just clarify. I am no longer associated with Vision America. I took a hiatus. I turned over Vision America to a subordinate named John Graves, who's doing a great job with that organization. And I actually spent 18 months in Washington, D.C., teaching Bible studies to members of Congress and in the State Department. But, I got to missing what I was called to do, and that's mobilize the church. And so I came back to Texas. Some of my former board members and I set up a brand new organization, Recover America Now. Basically does the same thing, only we would like to think a little bit better. You learn with time. But oddly enough, in the interim, the Jonathan Project, they had contacted me in 2016, about the time I was handing the reins of Vision America over to John Graves, and asked me to be their national spokesperson. At the time, I wasn't interested, but the second time, I was very interested, and I discovered what they'd accomplished in the 4 intervening years. Kerby, I think it's the greatest tool for Christians to get registered and to assist pastors in voter registration that I have ever seen. Peter Hirsen, who owns venues in 10 states. He owns Dolly World over in Pigeon Forge. He owns Silver Dollar City in Branson. All of his venues are family-friendly because he's a committed Christian. And in 2015, like a lot of us, he said, why aren't more Christians voting? And so he took his organization and his finances, and he pulled together some of the greatest political minds in the movement. I'm not honking my own horn, but he saw me as one of the leading advocates to get pastors involved. Tried to hire me in 2016, but the second time he approached me, I was wide open because I was in a time of change, and I am delighted to tell your audience that at no cost to the church, because of Mr. Hirschen's love of the church, he created an organization. The name Jonathan Project connotes that it's his belief that as Jonathan was a friend to the anointed one David, that our ministry should be a friend to the pastor. And then that pastors are so busy, they've got more on their plate than they can say grace over. We do everything for them at no cost. All we look for is an invitation, and just turn us loose, and we'll get every unregistered member of that church registered if given the chance.
And again, we have all that information for you on our website. Of course, the Jonathan Project is just jonathanproject.org.
Right.
And let's, if we can, talk about how to get involved, because you are right. You have been a pastor. Pastors say, oh, yeah, one more thing I need to put on my list.
Right.
But they also recognize that there are very important elections. And so if somebody wants to get involved, We have a link, and it has resources and frequently asked questions and all that. But somebody says, okay, I'm ready to get involved. What do I do next?
Well, there's a page there for them to simply request more information. But the easier way, and I don't mind them having my personal email address, because my role in this thing is to connect churches to the organization, rs@jonathanproject.org, RS for Rick Scarborough, rs@jonathanproject.org, and we'll get that ball rolling. We've got a number of field staff that can literally come to the church property if requested, but it can all be done online. And because of the incredible technical abilities we have through the graciousness of Peter Hirsen, there's a lot of technology now, more than I personally understand, that enables us to diagnose who in the church is not registered. We're doing a lot of things that we've had to develop because of COVID-19, and so many churches aren't fully gathering even now in a lot of states. But we can do everything through the mail. We diagnose who needs a voter registration, and we will send it to them. And we even go so far as to make it postage paid, an envelope. They fill out that card. They can just simply drop it in the mail. We'll pay the postage and get them registered. Because, Kirby, one of the great tragedies is about 50% of those who are regular church attenders are not registered, and we're trying to fix that.
Yeah, you knew where I was going to go next, because I'm going to say, Rick, tell me how many people in a typical church are registered, and so you know that. And even when they're registered, I think there is something, Dr. Scarborough, Rick, for just a minute, that we've got to talk about, and that is, you know that a lot of people maybe know who they're going to vote for president, maybe the Senate, maybe Congress, but they don't pay a lot of attention down ballot. And this pandemic, I think, has told people for the first time, you better pay attention to who your mayor is, you better pay attention to who your city judge, your county judge is, or even your city council, because they're making all sorts of decisions about your life that you actually never realized they could make, right?
The reason I have always loved you, Kirby, is because you're always on top of the real issues. And I love your audience because they're being informed every day when they listen to you. But you're right. We've had a picture-perfect run-up to the Antichrist. We have found out just how far people in elective office will overstep their bounds to enforce their will on the people. And we're seeing in some of the more liberal cities and states now a crystal clear picture of what we can expect because they're wielding power, they're making decisions that affect our livelihood, our congregating as church members, all under the name of health. We found ourselves in a period in which much evil is being inflicted upon the people, and it's literally crushing the church. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors are either ignorantly or willfully allowing this to happen. So this is the time for the church to rise up and be the church.
Well, again, let's, if we can, just before we take a break, talk about the link, because this is one that is pretty straightforward. And really what you're looking for is maybe to find a pastor listening right now, or somebody in the congregation to take it to the pastor. And it doesn't require them to really do anything. It seems like this is probably more of a plug and play, ready to go kind of project, right?
That is correct. And Mr. Hirsen is just an incredible benefactor. He built a strong board of like-minded men so that everything is paid for, including even staffing if a church requires it. But we use a lot of technology to discern who's not registered. We can help a pastor understand his flock better. It's been my experience that pastors who love God, when given the right equipment, go to work, and we will do all of the research for them. We'll let them know who in their church isn't registered. And we will even put in the mail a letter. If the pastor wants it over his signature, we can arrange that. There are, at the resource page, there is Bible study materials that can be used either for a portion of the Sunday school hour or for the whole hour during the month of September to inform people of the issues and a little bit about our godly heritage. And then there's even videos that can be shown and branded as the churches. We're not looking to get any kind of notoriety in the church. We simply want to come alongside pastors and help them get their people registered. Because as you so well know, Kirby, this election is the election, and the outcome is going to impact the future of freedom, the advancement of the kingdom, it is so important that Christians vote their values this time.
Let's take a break, and when I come back, I want to talk about that because we talk about the fact that you have a presidential election, 35 U.S. Senate elections, 435 elections for the House of Representatives, not to mention governor's races and state legislative races, all the way down. You better pay attention all the way down. This pandemic and lockdown illustrated how people you don't even know about can affect your lives. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes. Dr. Rick Scarborough with us. And Rick, let's, if we can, talk about the importance of this election. Anybody's listened to Point of View, even back in the days when Marla Maddox was the host, say, well, we always say this is the most important election, but this one really is for a variety of reasons. Let's look at the judges for just a minute. Kelly Shackelford is always sitting to my right every Friday when we talk about the judges, and already 200 have been confirmed. The median age is much younger, so these will be influencing your children and your grandchildren, maybe even your great-grandchildren in a few cases. And the president's hoping by the time this term ends, he'll have 300. But you can imagine if he is reelected and the same kind of justices make their way to the Supreme Court, the same kind of judges make their way to the Supreme Court, even some of these crazy decisions that came down in the last 2 weeks probably will not happen. But if indeed you have Joe Biden or whoever whoever the Democratic nominee might be, you know it's going to go in a different direction. So judges alone are important. Pro-life issues are important. The whole issue of law and law, who would have thought that anarchy versus law and order would be an issue? But those are just a few. So give us some thoughts on why you think this is such an important election.
Well, this election is illustrated by what's happening right now in the public square. Look at the liberal cities. Look at where the leftist philosophy has been allowed to germinate and take root, and you will see exactly what the intent of the left is for our entire country. They hate President Trump because many of them are not nationalists, but rather they're globalists. He's upset the apple cart because he came in saying, I'm going to make America great again. He came in advocating strong nationalism. He gave us pride in our country, but it completely rearranged the table after those 8 years of Obama and Biden. And so everyone in the listening audience, whether you're Republican or Democrat, I call myself a Christocrat. But if you want to see where the country will go, look at these leftist cities. And if you like anarchy, if you like the dismantling of our heritage and the tearing down of our statutes, well, all you've got to do is sit back and do nothing or vote for one of their candidates, and that's what you're going to get. And you know, Kirby, because of my deep concern and the fact I've been involved as a pastor in these issues, I started a podcast about a month ago, Rick Scarborough, Mixing Church and State God's Way. This week, the podcast is simply entitled, As Evil Rises, Monuments Fall. Everybody in the audience needs to hear what I have to say about that, because the truth is, that's the choice in this election.
Where would they find that podcast? We'll put that link up there in just a minute.
On any of the major platforms, but they can go to my website at recoveramericannow.org. And in fact, there's two immediate places to weigh in. There's an online petition in support of law enforcement. We want to say to our law enforcement officers that we love them and support them. And the podcast comes up immediately. And I would really like this audience to hear that podcast.
Okay, we do have that link up there. And on the left-hand side, it has signed petition. Then there's a place where you can donate, and then the podcast. Right. And you click it up. And then it's Mixing Church and State God's Way. So we do have that link already on the website, and you can certainly deal with that. And let's overwhelm him like we did last time, because that would be a great resource. But I've got to ask a former pastor for just a minute to talk to the pastors listening right now, because you know as well as I do, we've had George Barna here, we've had Gary Frazier, we've had a variety of others that have said that when they have done various surveys of pastors and asked, does the Bible speak to these issues? And they list them and all sorts of different kinds of issues, and they say yes. And then we ask, do you actually preach on those issues? And they never really do. And yet when we ask the congregations, would you like biblical instruction on these issues? They all say yes. And we used to have patriot preachers that would actually address very important issues in the 18th century. And in some respects, those were the individuals that eventually gave us the American Revolution. So what would you say to pastors right now that wonder what they should say from the pulpit about the importance of voting in some of these key issues facing America?
I'd say preachers don't make a liar out of me. I've had face-to-face disagreement with George Barna, and as recent as yesterday, confronted another key layman that some of you would know, who is just saying, man, preachers won't stand, they don't care. I believe you do care. I believe that those of you, especially in our smaller churches, you're in small churches not because you're not capable of a large church, but because you have been unwilling to bend. You've stood strong and perhaps even been fired for what you believe. This is the time, Patriot pastors, to stand up, speak up, and refuse to give up. I believe you're out there. I believe that you're an army, and I believe you're the only hope for America to survive. Man, I'm pulling for you. I believe in you, and I know you're still out there.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people can contact you one more time, because if nothing else, you were willing to give your email, and if I understand it, it's rs@jonathanproject.org. So rs@jonathanproject.org. And again, for pastors who might say, look, I'm really busy, you're not asking for anything other than just let's come alongside you. Let's give you books, resources, flyers, whatever you think you need. You can even brand them with your church logo on it, because what we really want to do is we want to get some of the people in the stands watching the field and to get out on the field and participate. So really, that's what you're looking for. And so one last time, how can we be involved with what you do at Recover America Now and the Jonathan Project?
Just go online and connect with us. Let us know you're out there. That just let us know that you want somebody to contact you, and I'll give you my word, within 48 hours you'll get a personal contact. So either go to our website, jonathanproject.org, come directly to me, rs@jonathanproject.org. We're here to serve you. We believe the church is the only hope for this country. Hence, recoveramericannow.org. The church is the answer. Kerby, I'm so grateful for the clarity of your voice and for you letting me be a part of the program today.
Well, Dr. Rick Scarborough will do it again, but I just wanted to get this out to our audience and encourage them to take some appropriate stands. And what a great time to do that just a few days before the day of Independence, our Independence Day, where we celebrate that as well. So, Dr. Rick Scarborough, always great to have you on the program. You have an invitation anytime.
Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.
Let's take a break. And when we come back tomorrow, we've got a couple things. We will, of course, kind of get ready for the 4th of July and Independence Day. But also, we're going to talk a little bit about Israel. I think you're going to enjoy that because Mitch Glazer has a book called The Messiah in the Passover. And so I'm looking forward to that. He's the president of Chosen People. I thought it'd be kind of a fun look at that as well. And, of course, speaking of the various feasts, we already, of course, talked about the return with Alveda King. So we've got some great material that I would hope that you could use, and it is all available at the website pointofview.net. Now, I did mention earlier, and I didn't really want to talk about it too much, we had that matching fund. We met more than $50,000 of that, so that's good. And the other one, of course, as we had heard from Foster Freeze, was going to be extended till July 15th. But I recognize right now that we did get some mail and a few other things, so I'll try to give you more of an update on where we are. I think we're still short, but that gives us a little more time to finish that off, and we are so grateful for those of you that have supported this ministry, and thank you so very much for listening. Just before we take a break, let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary today is on the liberal blacklist. And it's just a reminder that if you're not radical enough, the radicals will come back and eat your lunch as well. It does remind me of the French Revolution. And so that one talks about J.K. Rowling. And, of course, there's many other examples, but I just use that one as a perfect illustration of anybody that thinks that you're going to appease radicals. You just don't understand. You just simply don't understand. And so, if anything, we need to stand for truth, and that's what we are trying to do here at Point of View. So I want to thank everybody that's been involved in this broadcast today. I certainly want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Tomorrow, we've got a couple of different issues we'll be talking about simultaneously, so I hope you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really